So let's jump over to Facebook and see. Well, it says they're all live right now, so that's a good thing. Let's make sure. It appears that we may have actually done it. Kraig, we might actually be live.
Alrighty. Well, let's start.
Yep. Okay, cool. All right,
Yeah.
So we do have people watching, so welcome those of you that are with us. We are sorry we got a little started a few minutes late. As always, those technical difficulties love to mess with us. But today you're in for a treat. We are talking all things IDP, which I know will make plenty of you in our community super excited or super sad. I guess depends on how you look at IDP. But either way, we're going to have a good time tonight. We're going to talk about a lot of the moves that happened in free agency and how it happened, and how that actually helps or hurts your fantasy team. With me tonight, I have the man, the myth, Kraig, our resident IDP wizard. How are you, Kraig?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing, Brad?
As a guy who's an extrovert by nature, this being shut-in thing is not going so well. But, I just keep trying to enjoy the little things as best I can. Keeping my kids involved, engaged, and getting their schoolwork done is always a big thing. But can't complain otherwise.
Yeah, well, keeping the kids going, that's a full-time job itself, so.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, obviously we're in a different time, and I appreciate technology just as much as it drives me crazy. But, this whole e-learning thing these kids have and the tablets and laptops and all the stuff that they're using, I'm always super impressed with how much ability they have to do their schoolwork. So can't complain too much. I'll be glad when this is all said and done, though, so we can get back to life and seeing people and going to school and all those fun things.
Yeah, my kids just started the e-learning today. So
oh, yeah? And it went okay?
Yeah, we did a little bit once I got done with work. But as Paul said, mine went to bed not that long ago. So hopefully they stay quiet.
Yeah, that was mine. We normally start bedtime about 7:30 ish, brushing teeth and all that stuff. And I laid them down and read a book, and we're just kind of hanging out. And by about 8:30 they were out. And I was like, oh, I get a whole 45 minutes before we got to start going. It's like my birthday.
It's about as good as you can hope for.
I know, right? So tonight we're gonna talk IDP, and a lot of things happened. There was a lot of moving pieces with free agency, and a lot of times when we're doing these streams or doing podcasts, we try to plan it, but I kind of want it to be more of a fluid conversation. We had some weird things happen at the top. Like Byron Jones was the highest paid defensive free agent, which I thought was interesting. Of all the free agents, he would get the most money. So I'm going to kind of treat this as a league that you have to start all the different positions so that we actually have something to talk about. I know a couple of my IDP leagues that I'm in, they don't. It's a secondary position where you can either start corner or safety. I know some of the other leagues I'm in, like the one I do with you and Paul, you're starting every position. So there's a little bit of everything. So we'll start at the top and we'll talk about Byron Jones, but we'll probably bop around to the different position groups just because there's so many different pieces to talk about. What you think about Byron Jones, the landing spot, going to a little bit of a different scheme? What does it mean for fantasy? Do you think there's relevance to him there? What's your take on him?
If you're looking at a cornerback required league, I can see having him on your roster and using him. I mean, cornerbacks are really hit and miss, and I think he's going to have more value in Miami than he did in Dallas in that position. His talent's still there, but it's all going to depend on how they use him. The benefit will be that he is the better cornerback opposite of him, so they can't just pick on that guy. and not throw his way. You're going to have two really good ones in him and Howard. So it's sort of a pick your poison. I don't really get the amount of money they threw at him, but
that was a lot of money.
Yeah, I mean, and if they decide to use him at safety at all, I think he'd have a lot more value, as he showed when he played safety, as sort of that jack of all trades, sort of before Derwin James was doing that same sort of thing, where he had a lot more value. But Dallas just didn't use him that way the past few years, and he's a really good NFL player. Fantasy-wise, the production generally just isn't there as much because of how good he is.
Yeah, I mean, once the signing happened, I started looking back through, the value and where he ranked, and he really wasn't in the top, 10 of corners, specifically cornerbacks. When you look at the actual value over the last few years, I'm like, they paid a lot of money for what could be a waste. I mean, I know Miami's a team that had a lot of money to spend, and they're kind of trying to bounce back, but it seemed like maybe a little bit of a reach spending all that on him, especially with having already a number one in Xavier Howard there.
And I've seen this with the contracts a lot this year, and I don't have the historical reference for all of them at hand, but I do like that with a lot of these contracts with the big money, they aren't where you just have constant dead cap down the road that's going to kill you. Like, most of it's locked up in the first 3 years. So if it goes poorly, it's going to be bad for those 3 years, but it's not going to ruin them long term. And I think a lot of the contracts in general have been that way. So I don't know if Kirk Cousins sort of started something with him having all that guaranteed money over a couple of years, and people are thinking that's going to be the way it goes. I think it's better for teams and players that way personally, but I did like that in the contract.
Yeah, I mean, Cousins' contract, I think, really started to set the table for people to get fully guaranteed shorter deals. I don't have a problem with the team signing a guy to 2-3 year windows, fully guaranteed money. I mean, you see that in plenty of places and in other sports, and football. Most of the time, we know they're not getting to the final year or two of the deal just because of the way it's structured. Teams can get out by the last year or two. So it's interesting, for me, coming from the Detroit, being a Lions fan, and seeing how completely horrible the defense is when they're trying to take former Patriots or guys that are Patriots types players, and you saw Miami do a lot of that this year. Eric Rao going over to strong safety or potentially strong safety. Bringing in Kyle Van Noy. Obviously, Byron Jones is not affiliated to New England in any way, but I'm surprised Miami's looking at Detroit's blueprint and going, oh, it's failing for them, so let's keep trying bringing in former Patriots and seeing how that helps. But for a guy like a Kyle Van Noy, another Miami signing, what do you think there's value for him at the linebacker position, fantasy wise? I know in Detroit he wasn't relevant, and then in New England he's been kind of up and down. What's your take of the next Miami Dolphin signing?
I think just based on how they have their team makeup right now, with their defensive line, it's sort of a ragtag bunch of guys, and then at linebacker, they don't really have a whole lot else. I mean, they have Jerome Baker, who's looked good at times and I think has potential. But other than that, McMillan hasn't shown a lot consistently and hasn't really stayed healthy. So there's definitely tackles there to be gained. And kind of like you said with that blueprint, it's what the Detroit Lions are doing, which they kind of got from the Patriots. Of course, both of the head coaches are, I believe, former defensive coordinators under, quote unquote defensive coordinators, because Belichick did a lot of it. But I personally think that Flores has shown himself to be a better coach than Matt Patricia already. Whether or not he's, a better idea of the talent and value of those former Patriot players remains to be seen. But I guess I'd like him and what he's doing more, and I'll give him the benefit of the doubt in that regard more than I would Matt Patricia at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I was really hoping Patricia would have been gone last year. He's not really done a very good job in Detroit. He's only kind of made things worse. And he's doubling down, Hey, let's just keep signing more Patriots and making it even worse. And for me, Miami's defense is one of those, I like the Shaq Lawson signing. I'm cautiously optimistic about Byron Jones, but in most cases, I like them as a football team the way they're going, not necessarily fantasy relevance. I thought the Christian Wilkins draft pick last year was interesting. Depending on how they used him, and we saw in year one it wasn't really all that great. I'm really interested to see. Oh, sorry, I'm trying to go through the comments and see what Paul's saying over on Facebook. I'm really interested.
Nothing bad yet.
See how it goes with him, and I'm glad you're with us, Paul. Although I can't see the comments. There we go. Hey, and Anthony Leone's on there. Oh, but we're not live on YouTube. All right, so go ahead and talk about another guy that you liked in this free agent class while I try to figure out why YouTube is not working.
Well, someone that I see not in person, but on TV more than any Cowboy, unfortunately, which is my team, the Packers. As I'm up in Wisconsin, I'm constantly seeing them. I thought the Blake Martinez signing in New York Giants to kind of be their main linebacker was a really good one. And I liked his contract a lot. If you look at the other linebacker signings in similar positions, like Joe Schobert got similar money, a little bit more. He got less guaranteed money, but Martinez has had better production, even with missing some time, although they've both missed time. It's another contract that I like where most of it's up front over 2 years. They can get out if they want to, but there's a lot of tackles to be had behind that Giants defensive line, which is looking like it could be really well be put together. So I think he's going to eat sort of like he did in Green Bay. If he stays healthy, I think he'd be a really good addition to anyone out there that's looking at that in a startup or something.
Yeah, and I thought, speaking of linebackers, I thought there was an interesting question, and I tagged you, and I saw you comment. There was one of our Facebook community people asked a question about Miles Jack earlier today, and he was out on the free agent wire and asked kind of what would you pay to get him. And I'm surprised I've never seen him out on waivers on any of the leagues I've been in. If he was on waivers, I'd probably snatch him up. Linebacker's one of those where if you're young and you have any kind of upside, I'm probably going to try to roster you in most cases. And I don't remember who asked the question on Facebook, but they said, how much would you spend on Miles Jack if he was on your free agent wire? And I think you said something like I wouldn't spend more than 20. And I think I said something like 15 to 25. When we're talking about linebackers and specifically going to a team like Jacksonville where they've kind of been blowing the thing up, trading away pieces and moving guys, and they move, and it sounds like they're moving Miles Jack back to the outside, which seems like it would be a cut into his value for fantasy, depending on if he's going to be in their sub packages. If he's kind of a nickel linebacker, then that maybe doesn't so much hurt his value. But what do you make of something like that with a guy like Miles Jack, who's young, very talented, can go sideline to sideline, very athletic and speedy? What do you make of something like that?
I personally think it shows a lack of faith that they had in him by going out and getting Schobert. Schobert had put up really good stats, which was much more crowded Browns linebacking core when they had Collins, Kirksey, and they added Mack Wilson. I know they didn't all play at the same time, and they had a whole lot of injuries cutting into each other's who played when and with whom. But I think he's going to do very well in Jacksonville, and I think part of that is a lack of faith in Miles Jack. Now, they kind of got into a rough position when Talvin Smith took the year off, and it doesn't sound like anyone really knows for sure what's going on with him. At least I haven't seen that this year. A lot of the younger guys that they tried last year didn't pan out. In terms of real life, a couple of them put up, I think Donald Payne was one of them, put up nice statistics at the end of the year if you were looking for a plug-in linebacker that came out of nowhere. But real life, he was awful, and they certainly needed to upgrade on something like that. So, Jack's still going to be useful, like you said, with being young and having talent. There's no reason he should be on free agency in a serious IDP league. I just don't have a lot of faith in them having to start him every week.
Yeah, I can't argue that one. And until we see something more consistent out of him. I mean, I would get if I saw a good full season of him being a solid linebacker, I might consider that next year to put him in more often. But right now he is kind of a wait and see. Scott Temple over on YouTube, welcome. I'm glad you're here. Going back to Miami, Scott Temple asked, is Baker still a must-have at linebacker? So we're going back to Miami for a minute. Jerome Baker, what do you think of him? And is he still a must-have?
I wouldn't call him a must-have because I personally wouldn't be starting him every week unless you have to, so much of this with IDP is sort of like wide receivers. How many do you have to start every week? How many teams are in your league? I generally kind of think of in the 12 to 14 teams where you're starting probably 3 a week. So he's certainly valuable to have, but again, he's not someone in a league that size I'd want as one of my top 2 linebackers. I'd probably be on 12 to 14 team league, starting 3 guys. I'd want him as a 3rd or 4th linebacker if I had him.
Yeah, I traded him away last year in a few spots just because people were still excited and hyped about him, but I just haven't seen, kind of like Miles Jack. I liked him; he was a young guy, but I haven't seen the consistent production that I would like to see out of him. But I could be wrong. I like to trade, so oftentimes I'll sell a guy maybe a little earlier than I should. So, and then I admit I was wrong and go back and get him if I really want him.
Yeah, I've been there with guys too. Probably more often than I'd like to admit, but
All right, so next up, I'm looking through kind of who's been signed in free agency, and there's a lot of interesting names. One that I'm really surprised how this happened for him. He just turned 30, but Robert Quinn signed a 5-year, $70 million deal with $30 million guaranteed at signing with the Bears. Robert Quinn has always kind of been an interesting player, but I felt like they overpaid severely to get him. What's your take about Robert Quinn going to Chicago?
As again, a Dallas fan who watched him last year when he played quite a bit with the Cowboys, I was surprised at how much money he got. $30 million guaranteed is a lot, but if you look at that, that's pretty much over 2 years. So again, another one of those deals that looks like a ton of money, and if he plays it out all the way, and it will be, but
basically a 2-year deal with more.
Yeah, and they needed to get someone that they could trust across from, not directly across. I'm hoping they don't play him at outside linebacker because I think he showed that doesn't really work well. He kind of needs to be a down lineman. But, opposite rushing of Khalil Mack, they needed someone, so I understand why they went up and got him, but that's a lot of money for a guy that, like you said, I think he is 30 or turning 30 and has had a few years of, whether it's to injury or just poor performance, didn't play a whole lot, didn't play well. He turned it back on last year, but was contract seeking. You always have that worry with someone who's trying to get that last contract maybe. And, he has the talent, just is he going to put it together? I think it'll land somewhere in the middle. I don't think it's going to be an atrocious deal, but I don't think if you look back on it, it's going to end up being worth that kind of money that they paid for him.
Well, and the other interesting side of it is, if you look at his 2019 fantasy production, he was kind of like a defensive end too. He was right at like the 12 to 13, 14 range, depending on how your league scores. So it wasn't like he wasn't, valuable on a fairly regular basis, almost a weekly basis. But he was ahead of guys like Frank Clark, Calais Campbell, and some of these guys that have been kind of stalwarts in the fantasy world. So I was kind of pleasantly surprised when I looked back at his numbers. Kind of where he fell, but he's hitting that mark where almost any fantasy player at age 30 on, I'm really starting to say, okay, so when am I getting out of this? If I haven't already, when am I getting out of this? Would you, as soon as he got moved, would you start trying to sell him because of the hype of going to Chicago and all that money?
If you have someone that wants to bite on him, I would. If you look at his stats from last year, in 14 games he had, the tackles aren't as important for defensive linemen unless there's, altered scoring. But he had 13 tackles for a loss and 11.5 sacks last year.
Yeah.
Over 14 games, which is a lot. The prior 2 years, he had 9 and 9 tackles for a loss, but 6.5 and 8.5 sacks. So he had significantly more production last year than the 2 years prior, and even the 2 years before that. Now those were injury shortened. He only played 9 and 8 games in there. How he performed the first few years in St. Louis once he became a full-time starter was more in line with what he did in Dallas. I just feel there's too much uncertainty for me to be investing anything significant in him in an AP league.
Yeah, I would agree. I probably definitely would try to move him if I had him, although I don't think I actually own him anywhere. I own some of the guys around him, in the rankings. I mean, obviously you got Eric Armstead's of the world, and Sam Hubbard was a little bit higher than him in ranking last year's numbers. But yeah, he's an interesting, because of the way the contract. I mean, it looked big on the outside, but the way the contract looked, he's one of those you're like, wow, that's kind of a. I mean, he was, when you look at the total amount of money potentially and the deal, there was only 3 defensive players that got 5-year deals, and he's considerably older than the other 2 that got big money.
Yeah, and I mean, if you look at Quinn too, the other thing is a lot of his production came in the first half of the year. Over the last 6 or so weeks, he had 3 sacks and I think like 4 tackles for a loss. So I mean, that's a large part of the year, especially when if you're competing for a playoff spot or something, that he's just not showing up for you, doing what you would hope he'd be doing.
For sure. All right, so I'm just going back through these comments to see what we got here. Oh, Connor Loveless over on Facebook says, I'm glad the Raiders got Littleton. The dude's a beast.
He's another guy that I think is really going to put up numbers. I mean, they needed a real good linebacker for that Raiders defense, and I think that defensive line is going to be even more improved and be able to take guys off their linebackers. They had signed another guy, I think, right before they got Littleton, the guy from Chicago, whose name I'm probably going to butcher, but it's like Nick Kwiatkowski or something, who I had in a couple leagues a few years ago when he was filling in for some injuries, and he's put up stats when he's played too. He just isn't a household name, and probably because he doesn't have the draft pedigree and all that. But I like both of those signings, but Littleton clearly I think should be the guy to own there. I have him in a few leagues and was happy with that spot too.
Yeah, it was smart. I mean, they moved the tackle machine to Tahir Whitehead to free agent, which was nice. I mean, he's always, as a Detroit guy, he always drove me crazy because he couldn't do anything other than rack up a bunch of tackles, which isn't terrible. But they really needed to upgrade that linebacker position, and they put a lot of emphasis on it. So I would still like to see them go into the draft and try to get one, even if it's one of their first round picks. I would love to see them get, Patrick Queen or one of those higher end linebackers to really solidify that defense. I think it would be very helpful. Let's see here. What else do we got? So talked about Van Noy. I was really sad to see this one happen. So Dante Fowler went over to Atlanta on a 3-year deal, basically $45 million. Atlanta linebackers always drive me crazy because it's kind of a feast or famine with them, where in LA he was feasting, and I liked it. What do you take on Fowler in the move to Atlanta?
Fowler's a guy that I've never really been able to quite get a grasp on, to be honest. I mean, he had showed a lot of potential at times when he was in Jacksonville, and other times he would just disappear. With everything coming out now, it makes you wonder how much of that was the team around him that was helping some of those stats or even hurting them. But it seems like they had a bad culture going on there in Jacksonville when stuff started going south. So he found himself when he moved to the Rams. Will that continue in Atlanta? I guess I'm skeptical myself. I don't think I'd be looking for him to repeat even what he did last year. I could be wrong, but it seems like a lot of those guys, McKinley and Beasley, which are basically being the same thing that Fowler's going to be playing this year, never really put it together. And those were, high-end draft picks too that you'd think would succeed in that system. And if they didn't, I guess I'm skeptical as to why Fowler's suddenly going to come along and do what they couldn't.
Yeah. Well, Paul says he hasn't been good since he was a Gator.
I'll take Paul's word on that. Anything Florida college sports, I revert to Paul. So
this normally Paul gets a little back and forth here on the stream, but this is going to be like the Paul Truther episode. We're all going to support his takes. Is that what I'm hearing?
Well, I have no idea. I mean, I couldn't tell you what he did in college, but clearly he did enough to be. He was a top 5 pick or something, if I remember right.
Yeah, I think Jacksonville took him early.
Yeah. So, clearly he did well in college, and they were expecting him to do well. And I agree, he hasn't lived up to that billing in the pros. So
yeah, no, not at all. So this is an interesting signing. One that I'm not sure if it helps or hurts some of the other guys in the secondary, but Malcolm Jenkins, who's 31, 32. Signed a 4-year deal to go back to New Orleans. Normally, I would be kind of excited, but having some of the other secondary pieces in New Orleans, I don't know. I think this hurts them more than anything. I like Chauncey Gardner-Johnson coming out, so I had a couple of shares of him. He obviously is going to be buried now. Marcus Williams kind of isn't really developing the way I expected him to. So, what's your take on Jenkins going back? Is it more to be a leader, mentor to some of these young guys? Is there fantasy relevance there? What do you think?
I'm going to be curious to see that myself. I mean, he's getting money where you'd think that he would be a starter, and to be honest, after the first couple of years in Philadelphia, he actually only had one or two really big years in Philadelphia.
Mm-hmm.
Now, Philadelphia hasn't had very consistent secondaries in a while, but, he performed better in Philly than he did in New Orleans. So are they going to use him any differently now that he's around? I'm hoping that it's more to help bring those younger guys along. Now, they do need someone to replace Von Bell, so is he going to do that? We'll see, but I liked what we saw at Chauncey last year, too, towards the end. So again, and this is just myself in Dynasty. I mean, with a lot of my teams, I try to look for the younger guys, and I probably do leave some value out on the board with a lot of these older guys. But I do think they have a place even on your fantasy roster if they aren't going to be producing as much in the NFL. Again, it's going to depend on your league setup. I can't tell you that Malcolm Jenkins is anyone that I've owned in quite a while in a league.
Yeah.
And I think it's just based on he hasn't done anything to excite me, I guess, when he was playing in Philadelphia. And I don't think that changes personally when he goes back to New Orleans.
Well, and the tough thing in Philly is they can't keep a guy healthy. I mean, their secondary was always like a ragtag bunch of free agents and leftovers because all their starters were hurt. And then so Malcolm Jenkins had the ability to eat because he had to basically make all the plays if they were going to make any back there. So Philadelphia has always been an interesting group, at least the last 3 to 4 years. I think basically since Jim Schwartz has been there.
Yeah, I mean Jenkins has played I think in every game.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's been very healthy.
Since 2014.
Yeah.
And if you're in a more tackle-heavy league, he would have more value in that than he would. Interceptions, he'd get you 1 or 2 a year, maybe a sack. But he was mainly a tackler. So if that's the sort of league that you're playing in, he'd have more value than in one of those high-scoring leagues.
Right.
Just for big play leagues, rather.
Yeah. Okay, so looking up and down this list, I think it'd be interesting to talk a little bit. A guy that I'm not happy about because my team signed him, Jamie Collins. He was in New England for a few years, did okay for fantasy and for the team. Went to Cleveland, was just a disaster of a player in that situation. Went back to New England, had a great season last year, put up nice LB numbers in fantasy, and now we paid $30 million over 3 years. What's your take? So I kind of want to expand it because Detroit signed Reggie Ragland. They've signed a bunch of linebackers. Obviously, Jerry Davis hadn't been developing and really is one of those guys that's all athletic profile, doesn't know how to slow down enough to tackle a guy. What's your take on kind of the Detroit linebacking situation? And for fantasy, are there guys you want to own? Are there guys that you're willing to roster? Guys that you're not going to touch? What's your take on that?
I think it's a mess, kind of like you alluded to. I like Collins if he's going to play. When he's been healthy, he's put up really good numbers. It's the issue of, is he being healthy? And I know that's for everybody, but, if you're looking at his past 5 years, 2018 and 2019, he played 16 games, put up really nice stats. The 3 years before that, he played in like 21 games combined. The best, someone once told me, and I can't quote him because I don't know who it was, the best ability is availability. And if he's not going to be out there for you to put out there and play and get your stats, why would you go out and get him? So, he's a really nice case on how risk averse are you? Are you going to be taking that shot that he's going to put up those stats and be out there for you, or is he going to go back to being hurt? I do like Ragland more than I like Jared Davis, as much as Paul is not going to like that comment. But you're a Lions fan, you have a better handle on it than I have, but I haven't seen anything out of actual NFL play-wise or fantasy stats that would make me want to roster Jared Davis at all.
Yeah, when Jared Davis came out, I was excited about him. Super athletic. Like, Detroit hasn't had a linebacker like him in a long time, but then as soon as I started watching him and started looking back at his college profile a little bit more, I was like, oh, I feel like this is Ernie Sims all over again. A dude that could basically cover the entire field but can't take a player down, And I've not seen anything that hasn't led me to see that. Like, he's going to go somewhere and become a starter after Detroit gets rid of him, because I fully anticipate this to be another dumpster fire season and they wash out the whole staff and front office, hopefully. And Davis is one of those guys that I would see be gone. Reggie Ragland, the interesting thing, though, is in Detroit, back when he was coming out 3-4 years ago or whatever it was, he was a guy that people really wanted Detroit to draft. So I'm surprised that, it's interesting how it's kind of come full circle and we have him. But it sounded like, a lot of the guys closer to the team, they brought him and Elijah Lee in more as like special teamer type guys to start. And I'm like, well, I think Reggie Ragland's probably from what I've seen, a more sure tackler than what we're trotting out there. I mean, Christian Jones, Gerard Davis, neither one of those guys are really good at tackling. So it'll be interesting to see how they deploy these guys, because I don't want anything at Jelani Tavai. Too slow, and maybe 20 years ago he'd have been a nice linebacker, but I'm just not interested in his profile. So Collins might be their most valuable linebacking asset, but I'm not sure I want to own him either.
Yeah, there's a big, what I've seen, injury risk with him. And again, what's the cost to get him? If you're going to get him off of waiver wires and you got to start a few linebackers, great. I'd love to have him in that sort of situation, but if you got to pay to get him, it's a completely different story.
Yeah, and you're right, and Paul, you're right. They definitely signed Kyle. They continue to try to overhaul that culture. Paul over on Facebook said Detroit overpaid. It seems like a culture sign, though. It is. Look at what Detroit's been doing. They kick out any guy that has a personality. Darius Slay was great for the community. He was always on Twitch and at basketball games and always trying to be active and involved, but he was a talker. So they kicked him out, and they continue to sign guys that will just shut up and play. And that doesn't mean they're good. That just means that they sign them. So, I could spend an entire stream talking about the mess that Detroit is. So I won't dive too far, but I will say that I agree with you, Paul, 100%. So let's see what we got here. You don't overpay.
Staying on Detroit.
Oh, go ahead.
Staying on Detroit for a second, you'd know this better than I do. The other consideration is how good is that defensive line, and how good are they going to be at keeping guys off of the linebackers? I know they did a lot of rotating last year, and I know they lost. Was that Ashawn Robinson, who had played well for them? They got Trey Flowers, who played well, and I think fantasy-wise would be a lot more useful if they played him more. But it seems, again, sort of like a whole bunch of parts they're throwing together, kind of like New England would do, hoping it would work. But I haven't seen anything great out of any of them except Flowers.
Well, the tough thing, and they've overhauled this defense again. The defensive line. I mean, they had Snacks Harrison, they had Mike Daniels, they had Ashawn Robinson. They last year going into the season, everybody was excited in Detroit because wow, we've got a lot of different guys. Well, none of them were healthy, and none of them stayed on the field, and the ones that were on the field weren't productive. I mean, Trey Flowers had some decent production at times last year, but definitely nothing consistent. Because he couldn't do it by himself. I mean, he's not good at beating double teams. He really needs somebody eating and clogging the middle so that he can do something on the outside. The problem that we have in Detroit is, Deshaun Hand and Austin Bryant are two guys that they drafted kind of like third, fourth round that they're expecting to develop and just haven't been able to stay healthy. So they're trotting out the likes of Romeo Okwara, who I like his brother Julian a whole lot more in this draft than I do him. Some of the free agent signings they've done this year, I mean, the Danny Shelton move to bring him over from New England, I think, as much as I don't like that they keep just signing more New England players, I like Danny Shelton as kind of the clogging defensive tackle that has a little bit of wiggle to him. There'll be times where he's able to kind of sneak through there. But he'll really, what he'll do is he'll draw double teams so that Trey Flowers has a chance. Or, I expect Detroit to address the defensive line again in the draft like they have the last few years. So I just hope they don't do it at pick 3. Derek Brown I think would be a bust as a top 5 pick. I'm not a big fan of him. But ultimately I think they'll be better off as long as these guys can all stay healthy. That unfortunately was not what happened last year. So if they're all healthy this year, I think they give the linebackers a chance to be successful. If any of these linebackers are forced to take on offensive linemen regularly, they're probably going to suck. I mean, it's not going to be good for them.
And Paul says that Flowers was hurt, which he was. Mm-hmm. I understand that, but he played in 15 games, and I think there were 6 games looking at this where his snap count was in the 70s or higher, which isn't a lot for a defensive end that you're paying a lot of money.
Right.
And, in fantasy, you want a defensive end that's going to be out there to get you stats. When he was in New England, he got a lot of tackles, but he also got pressure. He wasn't doing any of that last year for the most part, which to me, I was confused by it. But it seems like that's what Detroit was just doing. They did a lot of rotating guys, which maybe it's better from an NFL perspective, but fantasy-wise, it's a complete headache.
Yeah, I mean, and the tough thing for Flowers, he came in, if you look kind of statistically speaking, he was like a back-end DN too. He was a guy that you could probably get decent numbers out of on a weekly basis if you had to start him, but there were going to be weeks that he was going to piss you off too. So, he did okay. I mean, he had 7 sacks last year, 8 tackles for loss, about average amount of tackles. He's kind of been between 30 and 40 tackles a season for the last 3 years, so you kind of know what you're getting out of him. Hopefully he's healthy this year and plays in all 16, and they give him a little bit of a bump in snaps because I think that would be good for him. They paid him a lot of money for his talent.
Yeah.
So we'll see. I mean, I think fantasy-wise, Detroit's really only relevant pieces are whatever they draft this year. Trey Flowers, I wouldn't mind taking a flyer on Hand and Austin Bryant, but I'm not picking them hoping that they're going to play this year. I'm picking them as kind of like back end, I think I actually have a couple of Deshaun Hand shares on taxi squads, to see what happens. I mean, defensive ends in this scheme can be productive. Even Flowers not really playing a ton of snaps last year, not playing enough snaps last year, was still a top 25 defensive end. Linebacker-wise, I'm going to play wait and see. Secondary, I'm going to play wait and see. I like Tracy Walker, but the way that he plays safety, he's going to get himself hurt. I mean, the dude just throws himself like a missile at people. And it's like, you're going to take yourself out, dude.
I think he did last year, too.
I think he did get hurt.
Huge amount of time, but, yeah.
He also took out our newly signed wide receiver, Geronimo Allison, in the Week 3 game against the Packers. I remember him hitting Allison so hard, I thought he hurt him. I thought he hurt both of them.
Well, that'll be good for good viewing for the practices to see them go against each other.
Allison take a pop shot at him. Oh, Paul says Derek Brown is his defensive tackle 4 in this draft class. I don't know. It's tough for me. Like, I don't like Derek Brown because it seemed like he turned it on last year, and it almost seemed like he turned it on just so he could get drafted highly. Like the year or two before in college, he looked like he just would take plays off. He wasn't really hustling the whole time, so he kind of pissed me off and made me go, yeah, I'm not a big fan. Last year he played really well, but it was like he almost felt like it was a contract year guy. Like, I'm playing well so I can get drafted highly, and then I'm going to go back to being a meh defensive tackle. What do you think about him?
I think he's going to get drafted high, especially, and I mean, this is just the reality of the world that we live in and the way that the NFL offseason has played with our new reality. There's a lot of these guys from smaller schools or, where people didn't go get to see them in person as much. And yeah, you have tape, but the whole interview process is going to be different. You can't get them in for those one-on-one testings and drills. So I think a lot of those guys that may have had a chance to move up will fall back down. And those bigger names, I think, are going to be drafted more consistently higher in the draft just because they're viewed as a more known commodity, which I think if what you're saying about Brown is true, someone runs the risk of having a big problem of taking someone based off a name or 1 year production and then having it up in their face.
Well, I mean, I guess I'm not. I mean, with as many positions in this draft that I like a lot, defensive kind of interior defensive lineman, I'm just not as huge on. Neville Gallimore's probably like my favorite, but that's changed. I mean, I've liked Raekwon Davis and Kinlaw a lot. And Derek Brown, I don't mind, but he's probably defensive tackle 3, 4, or 5 for me if I really had to nail it down. But there's so many others that I like that are further down that I would rather take a shot on. I'm trying to think. I'm just trying to look back through my list of defensive tackles. Oh, like Rashad Lawrence from LSU. He's a guy that people have kind of slept on, but I liked his movement on the inside. That I'm like, well, if he went to the right situation, he could really bounce up. Or somebody like that. Where I don't want to spend top 10 draft capital on a guy like Brown and me be right, which I'm not always. I'm probably rarely right. I don't know half of what I think I know about fantasy sports. So
yeah, and I mean, I'll be honest. Like, defensive tackles aren't something that I've dove into that much. I've seen a lot of people having them up there really high. As Paul would say and probably tell you, it's not something I've watched tape on an exorbitant amount at this point. I don't have any leagues where we're doing rookie drafts before the NFL draft, although I'd be up for that at some point. But seeing where someone's drafted and the draft capital can matter, and then I go back before my drafts and sort of look at what they were talking about beforehand, how he played.
Yeah,
I don't do as much tape watch as someone like Paul before the draft.
Paul is a gem. He's the man. All right, so let's see what else. Now that we've gone down the rabbit hole of rookies, let's go back to free agency, which we were talking about. Are there names that we haven't mentioned that you think need to be brought up? So like a guy like Von Bell, we talked about earlier slightly. He went over to Cincinnati, and I think that's an interesting signing, getting paired with with some of what they've done in that secondary and what they already have. What do you make of a guy like Von Bell going to Cincinnati?
I was a bit confused by it. I mean, I like Von Bell a lot, but they have Williams under contract, and I think they have
Bates is still there as well.
Bates too. Yep. And maybe they're planning on, I don't know the contracts as I'm offhand. I'm trying to bring them up.
Well, Sean Williams is older, I think, isn't he? I think Sean Williams is getting close to 30, if not over 30. Where's he? Oh, he's 28. No, he's not that old.
He's turning 29 in this offseason. So, I mean, that's not terrible. And Bates is a younger guy, too. I don't know if they're expecting to lose one of them relatively soon and planning for it. I mean, I like Bell from a team perspective. He's a good guy to have back there. He's produced well. I just found it a bit curious myself. So how they split up those snaps in the secondary is going to be important to watch. If they're splitting it up evenly, it's going to make all of them a lot harder to use. Mm-hmm. I don't expect them to be doing that, but it's just something to be watching who wins out for those safety spots.
Well, and when it first happened, it made it made sense to me when I started to connect the dots. They have a team like Baltimore and Lamar Jackson in their division. They face twice a year. If you look at the blueprint of how the Chargers the year before in the playoffs kind of handled that mobile quarterback, where you deployed every safety you've got on the roster, hoping that you can slow him down, it made sense to me that they wanted to add some value. But the way that they worked Von Bell's deal, he'll be there every bit of the 3 years because they kind of backloaded it. It basically breaks down to a $6 million signing bonus, 3 the first year, 3 the second year, and then 5 that third year. So they're not getting rid of him because he costs even more at the end of the contract.
Yeah.
Plus, he's only 25. I mean, he's still super young and has some value there if he keeps producing.
And they're saying he's going to be playing the same as Bell, the same as Bates.
Yep.
I mean, Bates has been there for 2 years, so they have him for another 2 years. Are they looking at having a position change or something? I couldn't tell you. It's just maybe they don't like Bates as much as, he's not been a world beater, but I thought he played fine.
Yeah.
Maybe they view him just as an upgrade, which, nothing wrong with that either if that's how they're viewing it.
Yeah, and the interesting thing, for all of Cincinnati's shortcomings when it comes to being a dumpster fire of an organization, they've always been able to produce decent fantasy safeties. Like I've all, thinking back to like the Georgia Locas of the world. There was a few seasons where he was a thing, and Sean Williams has always been okay as long as he stays on the field and doesn't get suspended for being an idiot. Things like that. So it was intriguing to me as soon as I saw it. I went, okay, so what does this mean? Paul over on Facebook says Sean Williams loses value in this situation. I kind of want to see how this shakes out. If they're going to use them all regularly and they're all getting a fair amount of snaps, it might not be terrible. Well, we'll see. So over on Facebook, we've got another question. Elliot says, Xavier Rhodes, is he a sleeper now that he's lost a step? So what do you think about Xavier Rhodes? And he was a cap casualty in Minnesota there. What do you think happens for him?
Well, my personal Florida State expert has told me that Xavier Rhodes is washed up and that he's garbage. And that said, I don't know if I completely buy it. We've seen other cornerbacks have a bad years too and come back and have that bounce back for a year or two, and with what they're paying him, I certainly think it's worth a shot. It's nothing that's going to kill their team long term. I think the risk outweighs the potential reward, rather outweighs the risk that they have for someone like him for that sort of contract. So I liked the signing.
Yeah, he's one of those guys that with the head on his shoulders, he's a very intelligent corner. Like I would love to see him move to safety. He's a pretty decent tackler, and willing to do that. I could see him easily make a position change and maybe still have some nice value in that respect. But that won't happen. I mean, he's corner for sure. So let's see. Paul also says, going back to Cincinnati. So he knows a guy that you like, Jermaine Pratt. What do you like about Jermaine Pratt? Why should we buy Jermaine Pratt? Sell me on Jermaine Pratt.
Oh, Paul trying to throw me under the bus on stuff here. They really messed around a lot with their linebackers last year trying to figure out someone that worked. I mean, they had Nick Vigil who played a lot, and then everyone else was sort of in that in-between zone. I liked Pratt going into the year, and I'll admit he didn't play as much or perform as well as I thought that he would, but being a younger guy, only his first year in the league, he didn't put up bad numbers. I mean, he had 75 total tackles, 47 solo, 4 tackles for a loss. So, game to game, he wasn't someone that you were wanting to start, but as a depth piece and someone younger to have in a dynasty league, I liked his upside at the time, and I don't think he's done anything to ruin that at this point.
No, definitely not. And it'll be interesting to me to see kind of what they do. Like, I'm not a big Jordan Evans fan. I would like to see them upgrade that linebacker position to put somebody else alongside Pratt that would really help not only develop him but help kind of take some of that workload so that he can just kind of. He seems super athletic and he seems like he can kind of cover all over the place, and he's a good hitter that I would hate to see Cincinnati ruin him with leaving him next to somebody who I just don't like in Jordan Evans.
And they very well may. I mean, Vigil's an undrafted free agent, and he had left this year. Never mind.
Yeah, he's gone.
So yeah, they don't really have anyone because he went to the Chargers.
Right. Yeah. From what I'm seeing at the project, at least at the moment, what they've. I mean, because right now their linebacking core is weak. I mean, Jermaine Pratt, Hardy Nickerson Jr. would be the other linebacker that's young and possibly developmental. But other than that, they got older guys. Evans, Josh Bynes. I mean, that's and that's basically the long and the short of it. So I'm sure they'll do something with it. And the nice thing is there's a lot of talent in this draft class. I mean, like a guy like Willie Gay has been a name that's kind of been jumping up in people's. I've been hearing a lot of draft people talking about him. He had to sit out most of last year because he beat the crap out of a guy during practice last year. But I mean, for everything you hear, the guy's just an insanely talented linebacker who will get drafted later because of that. Because he didn't play last year, but he's a guy that could really, be. I mean, like going to a team like Cincinnati who's trying to rebuild. If they can get a couple linebackers in this draft later that can really step up and perform, kind of like you saw with Pratt. I mean, it could help them quickly.
And their defensive line rather is loaded with talent.
Oh yeah, especially for signing Reader.
Yeah, you can get a good linebacker back there, or you have someone step up like Pratt or Nickerson. They could really put up good numbers for you with that defensive line eating up the offensive line and having a lot more shots at the ball carrier.
Yeah, I mean, when teams as soon as the offseason started happening, people started saying, okay, who's the next San Francisco 49ers, where they go from kind of worst to first. And with the way that the AFC North is playing out, like if Cincy could get Joe Burrow and he's actually a good quarterback, and they could. And Jonah Williams bounces back. The way that this defense is built, I mean, Carlos Dunlap, DJ Reader they signed, Geno Atkins, Sam Hubbard. I mean, that defensive line is really solid, and it's deep. That's still not even mentioning Carl Lawson, Ryan Glasgow. Yep. I mean, that's a nice defensive line. You get a couple of decent linebackers. They paid a little bit in free agency to get, Trey Waynes to go with William Jackson, who's a nice corner. I mean, I don't normally say it, but I'm pleasantly surprised with Cincinnati. Like on paper, they look like a team that could, develop into something.
And they're deep everywhere. Like we said, they signed Von Bell, so they're the linebacker or the cornerbacks. They completely overhauled. They signed a lot of guys. Is it all going to gel? We'll have to see. But talent-wise, yeah, their defensive line and their secondary is really amped up. So if they can get a couple linebackers, they've really got a shot to be good.
Yeah, for sure.
And Elliot had a question about
Jatavis
didn't
Brown.
Cincinnati tend to play three safeties? Looking at snap counts, not really from what I could tell. I mean, the two main safeties both played, 93 to 98% of the snaps, and the next safety after that was, like 17% or something. So perhaps you're thinking of a different team, but I don't think that was them.
Yeah, and Elliot also has another question about another linebacker, Jatavis Brown in Philly. He says, the truther in me says this is his time to shine. I've liked Jatavis Brown. Like he's always been one of those guys. I'm like, man, I really hope he continues to develop because he's a nice young player. What do you make about that move?
I think it's a better spot for him in terms of he has a chance to go out there and produce, and if he can get playing time, like once in a while when he did with the Chargers, I think he showed that he could produce and was a good linebacker. Again, we've mentioned this a few times with different teams, but that Chargers linebacking core hasn't been healthy since I can remember. And the number of pieces that they've been moving in and out, guys all around, I think it's hard to have consistent production. Now, I haven't pulled it up here either, but I think Brown's also had some injury concerns.
Oh, but yeah.
If he can stay healthy, I think it's a good spot for him.
And for me, it's a perfect fit with I know Jim Schwartz well, being the former Lions coach. The type of defense that he deploys. Jatavis Brown very much. I know he's not a Mike linebacker, but he very much reminds me of Stephen Tulloch, who was a guy that was with Jim Schwartz for a long time in Tennessee and in Detroit. And looking at what Philly has for linebackers, I mean, he can easily kind of carve himself out a starting role. because there's not a lot ahead of him that is just as talented as him. TJ Edwards figures to probably be their starting Mike linebacker, and that's a name to kind of watch as a sleeper, because that position on that defense could get a lot of action. But they signed Duke Riley from Atlanta, and that's really it. I mean, they have Nathan Jerry and Alex Singleton, but those are just guys. Those are more depth than anything. So Brown could become a starter, if he plays his card right.
My guess is, the way things are right now, if the season started today, he probably would start.
Oh, yeah.
So if he's healthy and he keeps that position, I do think he's a value guy to be looking at that could potentially be on the waiver wire in your league or someone you could acquire cheap.
Yep, for sure. Yeah, Paul says, Chargers were another mess at linebacker. 1 week Perriman plays a lot, 1 week he's benched. Yeah, the Chargers were a mess last year, period.
Yeah. Well, it seems like they had a lot of years.
Yeah. Yeah, it's feast or famine there. So, going up and down this list, I think another team that really did well for themselves was a team like Arizona. Not only because of the offensive moves they made by fleecing the Texans, but defensive moves they made. Detroit made a dumb move in cutting Devon Kennard, but they immediately scooped him up at linebacker, and then they went and signed Devondre Campbell from Atlanta, who is a linebacker I've always been kind of a big fan of. What do you make of adding a couple linebackers like that into that defense?
I think that's the spot, if I'm remembering right, that they were weak last year for the most part, and they need a defense with guys that are able to get out and run and cover as linebackers, but they also needed a pass rush. So I think that they're trying to get some of that with their signings. Kennard, you saw him last year as Lions fan. He played well for him.
Yep. He was a sack machine for the most part.
That's something that they were really lacking last year as a defense. And if their offense puts it together, especially with Hopkins there now, and if Murray takes a step forward, there's going to be a lot more opportunities for Kennard to rush the passer and get some stats than maybe Arizona had last year. Elliott mentions that Hicks was a stud last year in IDP leagues, and he played really well. Campbell, I think Paul's a bit higher on than I am. But again, he played well last year too if you had him as your second linebacker. Mm-hmm. So not a lot to have an issue with as far as their signings there.
Yeah, for sure. Well, they're kind of slowly doing something. I like the Zach Allen drafting. When they drafted him, I think he's from Boston College, defensive end. They drafted last year. They signed Jordan Phillips in free agency this year. They had Corey Peters still, and then they add some of these pieces. The one thing that's always been disappointing is Hassan Reddick. When they drafted him in the first round a couple years ago, you really kind of expected him to really shine, really good athletic profile, but he's really done nothing. And at this point, it looks like he's probably going to wind up, being a backup, kind of a situational guy where I'm guessing you call him a situational pass rusher. I just don't know that he does that very well. But looking at this defense, really still the pieces to have are, I like Zach Allen. I have a few spots where I've gotten him. I like Budda Baker. I don't know how I feel about Thompson, either Jalen or Deontay. I think they're both, either one of those could be the starter at the other safety position. But, are there other guys on this defense that you're interested in trying to own?
Well, I'm looking at that. You had mentioned Reddick, and, he is something that we saw the same thing with Arizona with Deion Buchanan, where, Buchanan had a lot better year, but it was the same sort of thing. He had a year or two where he was amazing, and then whether the coaching staff got sick of him or he just fell apart, I don't know. But, he left last year, and I think he reunited, I don't remember what team it was with, but his former coach, and nothing happened there either. So it's really confusing to me, and maybe they just weren't that good in hindsight. But I think the signings overall are going to help someone like one of the big guys that you would want anyway, like a Chandler Jones. He's the big name outside of the linebackers that we had talked about, and he's someone that it looks like was a rare whiff for New England in terms of they got rid of him before they should have.
Right. Yeah, they tend to get rid of those guys all about the same time, and just unfortunately for them, Chandler Jones has continued to be a very productive player. So let's see here. So we saw and we talked about earlier Littleton leaving LA and Dante Fowler leaving LA, but they wound up kind of doing a sneaky move that might help backfill a little bit, and they went and snagged up Leonard Floyd. Do Leonard Floyd going to LA, do you think that kind of revives his value, or is he still going to be just kind of a wasted player?
I'm not betting on it, but I think there's a chance in the same sort of sense that, Fowler went out and got paid after going there. And, I think part of it's playing behind that defensive line. I mean, they just have they still do just a great defensive line. The Rams, yeah. And, Fowler was able to play behind him last year or two and increase his value clearly by the contract that he signed. Floyd, he's another guy that has all the talent in the world, but he just hasn't put it together. And can he stay healthy? From what I recall, he couldn't do that either one of them consistently in Chicago. And again, is that someone that I want to be betting a lot on at that point? No. And really, unless you're in a big play league, he's not someone really you're going to be looking at as a linebacker anyway.
Yeah, well, I like Paul's comment. Floyd will get a litmus test. If he fails this year, it's over. It kind of takes me to the point. You have to be careful with your linebackers, especially those guys that are insanely athletic. Over the years, I've seen the Aaron Currys of the world, or the Ernie Sims, like we've mentioned. Guys that are insanely athletic and have a really great athletic profile come into the league and just suck. And it's not even, and it may not necessarily be just, it could be injuries. I mean, like we've seen Leonard Floyd, he's gotten hurt quite a few times. You have to be careful, of falling in love with a guy just because of that athletic profile. And Floyd is one of those that I've never touched just because he always worried me. As much as I loved him in Chicago, anybody playing across from Mac, should have the opportunity to feast, but.
Yeah, I mean, the first year in 12 games, he showed a lot more, I think, than he did in the next few. His second year, he was hurt. He only played in 10 games. He still had 12 combined tackles for a loss and sacks. But then in 16 games the next 2 years, it's really just been the same as that injury-shortened year. So is he really going to be one of those guys that is going to consistently produce for you? So far, I wouldn't show that it has. And like you said, if he can't produce across from Khalil Mack, is he going to produce?
Probably not.
Yep.
You can't produce there. Yeah, and you're right, Paul. In fairness, Justin Houston also fits that profile. He's just been productive. One team that we haven't said literally a word about, but I definitely want to touch on because I love their head coach, and I was sad to see him leave Carolina. Riverboat Ron is a fantastic coach. Like I like him a lot. Not only do I like him as an individual, kind of how he runs things, but I like what he puts on the field. He tends to put a good product out there. They made a couple of sneaky signings that, and it's probably going to bite me because I've liked this guy for a while, but they signed Sean Davis away from Pittsburgh, and he'll probably slot in there right next to Landon Collins. What do you make of that type of a move, and do you see this guy being somebody who could wind up becoming one of those startable type safeties for you?
I think it's going to be difficult being across from Landon Collins. Collins is the guy that eats up the tackles and the big playmaker. So I could see Sean Davis. I've had Sean Davis on a few teams before. So I definitely think there's going to be a use for him, if you have him as if he's your second safety, and if he's your second safety and you're looking to upgrade on him, or if he's your third safety, I think I'd be all right with that. But the Washington team overall is very well put together, I think, at this point. And assuming that Rivera is able to do what he did in Carolina, I think they're going to be formidable if they can get their offense figured out.
And that'll be a tall task. I mean, they've got a lot of problems there. They got to figure out if they can keep that left tackle that wants to be traded or paid. And it's interesting to me how they're putting the defense together. He goes and gets a familiar face in Thomas Davis, and that guy will probably wind up being the starter in the middle for at least the first season. Paul says Washington is taking Isaiah Simmons some way, shape, or form. Book it. So is Isaiah Simmons Luke Kuechly? Is that kind of where Paul's going with this? Like going to get that hybrid linebacker that can do everything? What do you make of what he's saying? Do you think Washington goes after him?
I don't. I don't think they're going to invest in their defense in the first round. Personally, I think their offense needs way too much help. For them to be doing that, whether it's issues on the offensive line. Now, is that all fixed with the new regime and the new training staff and all that? Time will tell. I think what they do with Williams, if anything, during or leading up to the draft is going to be very telling. But to me, they have a good enough defense that they've invested enough into this point that I don't think that they're going to be going defense in the first round.
I don't think they have to, but the interesting thing to me, so they had been predominantly kind of a 3-4-ish type system. That's not really necessarily what Rivera runs, so it'll be interesting to me to see how they kind of put all these pieces on the field and what they do with it. I don't necessarily know how well Rivera can handle that, but they definitely have a lot more talent on the defense than the offense. I mean, when you look at that offensive line, it's a lot of kind of retreads and a couple of first-round picks. Scherf and Williams are kind of their high draft prospects, guys that they that are good, and then the rest are kind of just guys. But then you look at their wide receivers. Obviously, Scary Terry should be a starter for no problem, and they got Kelvin Harmon who should develop a little bit, but they don't really have a lot at wide receiver. So it's like, and then at tight end they don't have a lot. I mean, it's like wow, like it's almost like they have to invest in their offense most of the draft.
And their running back core is just sort of that throw it at the wall and hope something sticks. I mean, they got a little bit of everything going into this season. It'll be interesting to see how that plays out, and I'm guessing it's going to be a headache. But in terms of the NFL, they have a lot of talented guys at running back. There's not really a healthy world beater that I would trust at this point. But I think they have the pieces to have better real-life success than fantasy success at running back.
He's got his Stanford Christian McCaffrey lookalike in Bryce Love. That's all I'm going to say. I'm a Bryce Love fan. I wasn't up even after he got hurt. I've got him in taxi squads everywhere. I'm like, hey, Rivera likes his Stanford running backs that are shifty and can catch out of the backfield. Just saying, Bryce Love can do all that, and as long as he can stay healthy, which he only really had one major injury, but that injury was pretty major. So, but I ultimately expect them to invest a lot in the offense. Paul says if they pick up another first from Miami to move to 5, then take Simmons at 5, the other first is best player available offense. That's a lot of guessing and hoping there.
Paul, I hope that you're putting that in our mock draft contest so you lose some points on that when it doesn't happen.
Tamarian plays for the Redskins. I mean, both play for Indian teams. Oh, jeez, Paul. I'll tell you.
Another Debbie reference.
Yeah. So Washington's defense is one of those where I am trying to acquire a couple of pieces. I mean, I have Montez Sweat in a few leagues, but that was because I drafted him. I've always liked Deron Payne. I think I have him on taxi squads. I just don't ever think he'll really be much of a fantasy asset. Matt Ioannidis is kind of a sometimes you can pick him up and throw him in and he's relevant. Sometimes he's not. Jonathan Allen's kind of the other big name. Are there other guys on this defense that you're like, I want to try to get shares of, or if I don't have them, or I own them because I really like them?
I like, and not as much as some other people I know, but I really like what Cole Holcomb did last year. And when Rivera got there, he was talking him up a lot about how much he liked him and all the different things that he could do. And Thomas Davis isn't long for being a starter anymore, I don't think.
No.
But he'll probably start this year. But again, sort of like we talked about Malcolm Jenkins. Jenkins is probably a bit younger than Thomas Davis, but it's the same sort of thing. We're helping those younger guys probably come along and learn and grow while being on the field and still, giving you a solid guy that you can count on in the NFL. Long term, I like Holcomb a lot in terms of the linebacking core. I could see him turning out to be something nice.
Yeah, he's a good piece. Him and Sean Dion Hamilton are guys that I would like to try to take a flyer on and just see what happens with them. I think they're both are pretty solid. Holcomb is much more developed and probably way closer to being relevant, but I like them both.
If you have a spot in a league or two, I had Sean Dion Hamilton too.
Yeah.
And personally, I think he's better than a lot of the other guys that they have, in that back half of their linebacking core. But, someone else that, we got to see what happens, but they have Reuben Foster too.
Yeah. Very true.
He's
a stud if he plays.
Yeah, if he's healthy, if he can get healthy, be healthy, if he can get on the field and get his other issues behind him, he could be someone that you could get off of waivers when no one's paying attention and just stash and hope, and you haven't lost anything where he could end up just producing for you.
For sure. No, absolutely. So, as we get close to the end of this thing, are there other free agents that when you saw where they went, you were like, oh, I want to try to get this. I want to try to acquire some of this guy's shares. Were there any free agents that really excited you that we haven't talked about?
I don't know that he really excited me, but I think Christian Kirksey going to Green Bay is a good spot for him. He performed well when he was playing in Cleveland, and he had a lot more competition in terms of non-rush linebackers in Cleveland, as we'd already talked about with who they used to have. So going to Green Bay, where I don't feel they have as much of that pure linebacker talent. They have the rush linebackers that did really well for them last year. But with Martinez out of there, I think Kirksey could have a really good year for him.
Yeah, for sure.
And again, it's another nice contract where, it's, 1 year if things don't go really well, but even if it does go poorly, it's like a 2-year contract. So
yeah, for sure. Yeah, agree. So just looking up and down the list, I see Clinton Dix went to Dallas. That I had Clinton Dix for a while, and going to Dallas just doesn't excite me. Dallas and safeties don't always produce.
I think, again, it's a better
NFL
real
fit.
life.
Yeah. Agreed. Let's see what else we got here. Yeah, that's kind of about it. Well, if you guys over on Facebook, thank you for hanging out with us. Does anyone have any questions? I'm not seeing a ton of questions that we haven't answered. Oh, Paul agrees with you, Kirksey. So if you and Paul both agree, then gotta do it. Get Kirksey.
If you're looking at a defensive tackle required league, we mentioned him briefly, but DJ Reader in Cincinnati, he's not a huge name. There might be leagues, depending on how deep you are. I think the main IDP league that I'm in, he was available most of last year, so he could still be available for you if you're required for a defensive tackle.
Yeah. And
another one, if you're taking, a dart throw at someone, we talked about Dallas briefly, but Gerald McCoy, kind of like what we talked about with Robert Quinn, someone that they got cheap on basically a 1-year deal. I think McCoy is a 1-year deal. Dallas has had really good overall production from their defensive line for the past couple of years. It's been all over the place in terms of who gets it.
Right.
But sort of like Quinn did last year coming along and being opposite DeMarcus Lawrence, I think McCoy could have a really good year if you're looking for someone.
Yeah, I like one of the moves I like that I think it'll be interesting to see how it produces is Michael Pierce going to Minnesota. He goes from Baltimore's predominantly 3-4, where he's kind of just supposed to be the clogger in the middle that takes up space and does run stopping, where Minnesota likes to attack. I think that could give him a bump in value, and he might, depending on how well he actually can rush the passer, he might be able to get you a little bit there if you're looking for defensive tackles only. Uh, Paul, should I draft Kyle Duggar, Zuniga, or Zach Harrison? Oh, jeez. Paul, get out of here.
I like Duggar. I think he's going to be a really nice pick if he goes to a good position. I think the guy shown that he's smart and can play. He's someone that I think NFL teams know a lot more about than the IDP community necessarily. I do see his name brought up, but I wouldn't be surprised to see him go high in the draft too, in terms of like early second round.
Yeah, I think I listen to a lot of draft podcasts, and I think most of the ones that I've listened to kind of see him as a day 2 pick. All 3 of those guys, though, I need to see where they go. Like, I can't, at this point in time, I'm like, they have a lot of talent or they have a lot of value, but if they go, depending on where they go, that could easily get crapped right out the window. Duggar, I think, would probably be the most enticing of all 3. But I like Harrison a lot, too. I just, but that would be a wait and see. And Paul puts the laughter at the end, so I'm sure Paul is just trying to pull our chain. But
he wouldn't do that.
Never. Ask Anthony Leone. Let's see here.
But, with the draft like less than a month away here, I mean, we're going to have a lot more info on these guys in terms of what teams are thinking with them pretty soon here. So it's an exciting time of the year.
Yeah, the nice thing is they're keeping the draft where it's at. They're not moving it. And with the way this season has gone and with the craziness that's going on around us, it's a perfect time if you're somebody who follows the NFL like we do. It's a good time because you're hearing a lot of different things. I mean, most of the podcasts I listen to that are draft focused are kicking out new pods daily with what they're hearing from the media and. I really like Move the Sticks with his Bucky Brooks and Daniel Jeremiah. Those guys are connected to the NFL, so you're hearing a lot of whether it's smoke screens or not, what they're hearing from the people they talk to. So I like to take that. I obviously just take it with a grain of salt because this time of year you don't really know who's trying to blow smoke and who isn't. But it's nice to hear it to kind of see because what I'll do is I'll look back after the draft and say, okay, so which guys were BSing us and which ones were really serious. Everyone is excited about Taylor Rapp as I am. Yeah, I have Taylor Rapp in a couple spots, Paul. I really like him.
Yep.
Big fan. Oh, and so do you. So that works out. We're all in agreement, Paul.
Yeah, especially if that linebacking core doesn't end up being anything amazing like it currently isn't with the Rams.
They're going to get a ton of action.
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we're gonna wrap it up. We've gone over an hour now. I think we've hit most of the important, relevant IDP free agents. Those of you that have kept with us on YouTube and Facebook, thank you. Make sure you go become a part of the Facebook community because you're gonna ask IDP questions all year round. Find us on Discord. The scroller at the bottom of the screen has been scrolling all of our stuff. Find us on Twitter at RotoHeat Fantasy. Obviously Kraig and my Twitter handles are here. Hit us up on Twitter. We're posting content on the regular. Kraig and I are doing IDP rankings that'll be up on the site here soon. Our fearless leader's been working on getting that all locked up, so we've got that going. We're here to help you with IDP year round. So stick here. We'll try to do some more IDP specific streams, podcasts, things like that. So make sure you keep pumping through the questions. And Kraig, I appreciate you hanging out with me tonight. I know that we've been trying to do this for a few days, so it was nice to get to chit chat with you and hear your thoughts. And before we close out, do you have any other final thoughts? Anything else you thought you wanted to mention? And then we'll quit.
No, just kind of echo what you said. It was nice to be able to do this and kind of talk some of this stuff out with other people. You can always talk through it online, but doing it live is a different element and a lot more enjoyable to do than just getting into a Twitter war with someone or a back and forth. Occasionally when people see each other on message threads. And there's a lot yet to come yet. The NFL draft's going to show us a lot. And one of the things that I'm interested in, not only from a defensive side of it, but, is there going to be as much subterfuge from teams in terms of what they're going to be doing with the change and how things are just running in the world where people aren't seeing each other as much, where the communication is, phone call or text or email. I'm guessing there's a lot more just of the rumor mill period from people actually talking stuff. Anyone can make up a rumor, but how much of this has any sort of grain of truth? And our team's going to be able to get out as much disinformation, when we look back on it after the draft. So for me, that's another element of what's coming up that I'm kind of excited to see.
Oh, yeah. And as soon as that's over, then the best part of fantasy season is getting underway, all those rookie drafts. They begin.
All right, guys. Coming up for that.
For sure. So thank you guys for hanging out with us. Don't forget to go over to rotoheat.com. If you've been watching on YouTube and you've enjoyed our banter back and forth about IDP, click the like and subscribe notification information so you can keep up to date with all the stuff that we're doing.